Looking back on our classroom lesson, we started out with a magic experiment, which was simply adding different solutions to the cup of our indicator water, and it changed it to a different colors depending on if it was acid or a base. Our topic for this class was acid and bases, and our focus question was how do acid and bases affect the property of an object, our object being the different solutions that we used. So we started the class with the magic experiment, like I said, then we passed out a solution to each group. We had alcohol, bleach, and we had Mountain Dew. We also gave them a container of the indicator water, and we assigned each group a different element. So one did acid, one did base, and one did a neutral, and we had them come up with their own claim and evidence based off of what experiment or what observations they had during the class. In our experiment, we had a student in the class named Goldilocks ask about adding Mountain Dew to our indicator water to determine if it was an acid or a base. So we had her come up and test her own theory. Her question was, how does adding Mountain Dew affect the inhibitor? In her investigation, she added Mountain Dew into a cup and then added the cabbage water indicator into the cup as well. And that was the experiment, and the claim was when added to the Mountain Dew, the indicator water changed from a blue to a pink to a red, making it an acid. So through our experiment, we determined that Mountain Dew was an acid by adding it to the indicator water and watching it turn to a reddish-orange color. Now she's going to come up and talk about what happened in our classroom session and what their question and claim and evidence was.
So the classroom group that was covering acids came up with the focus question, how do different amounts of cabbage juice affect an acid color? And their claim was that the more cabbage juice, the darker the acid. And their evidence was with just a little bit of the Mountain Dew added, a little bit more and a little bit more. And they came up with the more that you add, the darker it's going to get. But that proved to be an unfair experiment because levels of the pH and the amounts weren't measured before and after. And that threw off the colors, like the darkness of it, because that doesn't really prove it. So that made the experiment a little bit unfair.
Our second part of our experiment that we did in the class in the video was we had a student ask what happens when we add bleach into the inhibitor water. So her question was simply, what does adding bleach do to the inhibitor? And by adding bleach, we determined that it was a base because it went from blue to green to yellow, showing that bleach is actually a base. And we're going to have that student come up and explain what happened in our actual classroom session.
So the group covering the bases came to pretty much the same conclusion that we did when we did our experiment, and they concluded that when bleach is added to the cabbage water, it changes from a blue to a green to a yellow, and therefore bleach is a base. In order for them to come to this conclusion, we put a color changing scale on the board to determine whether it was a base, an acid, or a neutral.
Last question that we had in our video was what happens when we add alcohol to the inhibitor water, the cabbage water. And that is exactly what our question was in our investigation. I had that student who had asked that question, add the alcohol and the inhibitor together, and we came up with the conclusion that it is a neutral because it kept the same color as the cabbage water even after adding the alcohol to it. So we're going to have that same student come up and describe what happened in the classroom setting.
So when we did this in the classroom setting, it came up with the same type of question and claim and evidence that we had, and that was, why does alcohol not change colors? And that's because alcohol is a neutral substance. And their evidence was after pouring the cabbage water into the alcohol, it did not change. And they were
After our classroom experiment, Professor Muhammad brought out a second experiment with the litmus paper, and when added to an acid, the blue paper turns red, and when added to a base, the red paper turns blue, to show the differences in pH levels. And we also had a scale on the side of the container that showed how acidic or basic it was. He brought up the point that we should have used the pH scale that was in the science source book during class, and we put that on the board as well after we did our experiment. So this is an experiment that we could have added into ours to get a different perspective on the actual pH instead of just focusing on the color change. Base or neutral. We had this on the board during their actual experiments so they could write down what it was when they were done. We had a question from the neutral group asking why it was neutral and the buildup of the element or solution and what made it neutral. And Professor Muhammad went into detail with us on the H positives and the OH negatives to tell us the differences in the molecular structure to determine whether it's an acid or base. And if it has more of a positive charge, it was an acid. If it had more of a negative charge, the OH negative was a base. And if it was a neutral, it was just canceled out. And during our experiment, this is the one thing that we did not cover. We could have done a lot more research on the actual molecular structure of each element to determine acid, base, or neutral. And that's the one thing, if we could go back and redo, we would do more research and more explanation on that so that we could better inform the class of the differences between acid, bases, and neutrals.